The storm signals have cleared the radar, but on the ground, a deceptive calm masks a rising catastrophe. Millions across the eastern United States are now trapped in a dangerous aftermath where the impact is far from over. With at least 30 confirmed dead and over 1 million customers losing power at the peak, this has evolved from a weather event into a systemic breakdown. Why did a routine disturbance explode into a coast-to-coast siege? How does a modern grid fail so completely under the weight of ice and subfreezing cold? The real emergency is just beginning for those left in the dark. Join us as we investigate why the end of the snow was only the start of the survival test. Over the last 24 hours, the main engine of this historic winter storm finally drifted off the east coast. However, the footprint it carved into the continent is staggering, stretching nearly 2,000 miles across the nation. From the frozen plains of the Midwest to the buried streets of New England, there is no relief. Cities are trying to function under a heavy blanket of snow and solid sheets of ice, all trapped beneath a deep Arctic air mass that refuses to lift. The Weather Prediction Center confirms that while the main snow shield has dissipated, the brutality of the cold has turned the landscape into stone. This changes everything. In the storm's wake, smaller disturbances, the so-called Alberta Clippers, continue to slide through the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. These systems deposit just enough new snow to camouflage black ice, undoing the work of road crews and slowing the cleanup to a crawl. It is a relentless cycle of clearing and recovering, transforming what was a singular dramatic event into a long, grinding test of endurance for half the country. Officials warned that the challenge facing residents is no longer just about shoveling driveways. It has escalated into a battle against the elements. The landscape is now dominated by a treacherous combination of deep snowpack and lingering ice, compounded by dangerous wind chills capable of freezing exposed skin in a matter of minutes. This threat is particularly acute for the thousands trapped in homes without power or adequate heating. The central question of this crisis has shifted. It is no longer asking when the snow will stop falling, but rather how long human beings can safely exist alongside what has already accumulated. To understand the magnitude of this event, we must rewind to January 23rd. When this historic winter storm first took shape, it appeared on weather maps as just another large system. Yet, in less than 3 days, it mutated into a coast-to-coast phenomenon, locking more than 20 states under a suffocating layer of snow, sleet, and freezing rain. According to the Weather Prediction Center, a relentless shield of heavy snow stretched from the Ozarks through the Ohio Valley and all the way into New England. But while the north was buried, the south was encased in glass. A band of ice intensified across the deep south and the lower Appalachians as warm, moist air was forced to override subfreezing air at the surface. This specific atmospheric mechanic allowed the same storm system to dump more than 50 centimeters of snow in New England while coating power lines in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Louisiana with up to an inch of solid, destructive ice. As the storm surged east and northeast, the true cost began to emerge, not in inches of snow, but in human lives. The toll appeared in real time, a grim accounting of a nation under siege. By the early hours of January 26th, at least 24 people across 14 states had already perished. New York confirmed at least 6 fatalities, while Texas and Tennessee each recorded 3. The tragedy was widespread, with deaths reported in Louisiana, Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Massachusetts, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. But as the day wore on, the numbers darkened further. By the afternoon, the nationwide death toll had climbed to at least 29, with some European outlets citing numbers as high as 30. These were not static figures, they were fluctuating rapidly as state agencies fought to reach isolated homes and frozen rural roads to check on the missing. Parallel to the human tragedy, the infrastructure began to buckle. At the storm's violent peak, more than 1 million electrical customers were plunged into darkness. This statistic represents roughly 2.5 million people suddenly stripped of reliable heat in the midst of dangerous sub-freezing temperatures. While repair crews made efforts to restore service, the numbers fell agonizingly slowly, leaving hundreds of thousands trapped in the cold by the evening of January 26th. For these families, the storm had technically vanished from the radar, yet on the ground, their darkest hours were only just beginning. Across the country, this logistical breakdown translated into a systemic shock to daily life. The skies emptied as the storm tightened its grip. Between January 24th and 26th, an estimated 13,000 to 15,000 flights were canceled nationwide. On January 25th alone, the system forced the scrapping of more than 11,000 flights, crippling major global hubs from Atlanta and Dallas, Fort Worth to Chicago, O'Hare, and New York. By January 26th, another 500 cancellations were added to the tally. At New York's LaGuardia Airport, the shutdown was absolute, lasting for hours as jets sat entombed in snowbanks with runway visibility reduced to near zero. For thousands of travelers, this was not merely a delay, the storm had effectively erased their journeys. On the ground, the paralysis was just as severe. Critical interstate corridors, including I-40 and I-70, vanished under sheets of black ice. Plow crews struggled in a losing battle, as fresh sleet and snow repeatedly buried lanes mere moments after they were cleared. Reports flooded in from multiple states, describing jackknife tractor, trailers, and spinouts that turned routine commutes into hours-long ordeals. In the dense urban corridor of New York and New Jersey, the situation was described as a traffic nightmare. NJ Transit suspended all service at the height of the chaos, only slowly attempting to restore routes as the system exited. With dozens of school districts closing or shifting to remote learning, the simple act of driving to a grocery store or work ceased to be a routine task and became a high-risk decision. But farther south, the texture of the disaster changed. It was no longer about the depth of the snow, but the crushing weight of the ice. In Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, the atmosphere waged a different kind of war. Heavy sleet and freezing rain accumulated on every exposed surface, snapping ancient trees like matchsticks and shearing off power poles under the intolerable load. Transmission lines toppled, severing the lifeline of electricity to vast swaths of the region. Rural roads, coated in a thick glass like glaze, became impassable zones, effectively cutting off entire communities from emergency response and slowing repair crews to a standstill. Behind every sterile statistic about outage numbers and canceled flights, a desperate human reality is unfolding. These are not just numbers on a screen, they are families huddled in darkening living rooms, fighting to keep food from spoiling and struggling to navigate a home that is rapidly losing its warmth. The landscape outside has turned hostile, forcing a shift in survival strategy, according to state governments and emergency management agencies. This is no longer just a weather event. It has graduated into a complex disaster response operation. States of emergency have been declared across the map, granting governors the power to mobilize the National Guard and open emergency operation centers that now run 24 hours a day. The response has become militarized in its efficiency. In several states, Guard units are deploying high-clearance vehicles to breach the icy isolation of rural neighborhoods, areas where standard ambulances and police cruisers simply cannot survive the terrain. These missions are critical. They are often the only way to perform welfare checks on the elderly and the medically fragile, people who are now trapped in freezing homes without the power that keeps their medical devices running. At the community level, the fight for survival has moved into public spaces. Local authorities have converted schools, churches, and community centers into warming shelters, creating islands of heat in a freezing ocean. These centers provide the basics of life: a heated room, food, cots, and a place to charge the phones that connect victims to the outside world. In the cities, outreach teams are expanding their nets, searching for the homeless to offer transportation to shelters or handing out blankets to those who refuse to leave the streets. The strategic focus has fundamentally shifted. The message is no longer just about staying off the roads. It is about ensuring the most vulnerable among us can survive the deep freeze that has settled in the storm's wake. Federal agencies are now backing up these local efforts with clear, repeated warnings that underscore the severity of the situation. The National Weather Service continues to highlight the extreme cold gripping the central and eastern United States, urging the public to limit time outdoors, dress in layers, and physically check on neighbors. But as the cold deepens, a more insidious threat emerges inside the very homes people are trying to heat. Officials are issuing urgent alerts against using outdoor grills or generators inside garages, basements, or living spaces. In the desperate attempt to stay warm, the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning has spiked, threatening to turn a survival situation into a silent tragedy. For the power companies, the battle is far from over. Utilities warn that full restoration is not a matter of hours, but potentially days in areas where thick ice still encases lines and sensitive equipment. They are pleading with customers to report downed wires, conserve power, and have backup plans ready should the grid fail again. In the aftermath of the adrenaline, the real work is just beginning. According to utility reports, more than 1 million customers lost electricity at the peak, and by the evening of January 26th, around 650,000 remained in the dark. This translates to hundreds of thousands of households trying to heat living rooms with portable devices, rationing hot water, and watching indoor thermometers fall as the Arctic air mass settles in. On the highways, the recovery is equally grueling. Transportation departments across the Midwest, the Ohio Valley, and the Northeast report a landscape still dominated by icy highways and hard-packed snow. For the plow teams and salt trucks, this is a Sisyphean task. They are not clearing the roads once and moving on. They are forced to circle back over the same stretches of critical arteries like I-40 and I-70 as blowing drifts and new snow from clipper systems recover the pavement. In the dense urban corridors of New York and New Jersey, transit agencies are slowly restoring rail and bus service, yet drivers are still navigating narrowed lanes and towering snowbanks that obscure intersections. Even the cleanup phase carries lethal risks for the workers and first responders who must operate on these slick, unpredictable roads. Recovery is happening block by block as residents dig out fire hydrants and rearrange their lives around a storm that has shifted from a breaking news headline to a freezing, daily routine of survival. In the bigger picture, this storm is forcing officials and communities to confront familiar, structural weaknesses that lie buried beneath the snow. The tragedy here lies in a disturbing paradox. According to forecasters at the Weather Prediction Center and the National Weather Service, the event unfolded almost exactly as the computer models suggested. The heavy snow, the broad band of devastating ice in the south, and the surge of Arctic air were all highlighted days in advance. We knew it was coming. Yet, despite accurate intelligence, the result was still catastrophic. More than 1 million customers lost power at the peak. Hundreds of thousands remained in the dark into January 26th, and at least 29 to 30 people lost their lives across 14 states. The gap is no longer about meteorological prediction, it is about infrastructure reality. It is a question of how fast our physical and social systems can adjust when the inevitable arrives. For the architects of the power grids, this storm serves as a harsh indictment of overhead lines, aging poles, and remote substations, all of which proved defenseless against the physics of freezing rain and dense sleet. Utilities are once again forced to weigh the financial cost of burying lines and hardening equipment against the human cost of repeated, large-scale failures during Arctic outbreaks. Transportation agencies face similar existential questions. With long stretches of interstate highways, commuter rail systems, and major airports shutting down or slowing to a crawl, the challenge now is deciding what level of disruption is acceptable and what investments are required to keep essential services moving when the next storm strikes. However, at the community level, the lesson is about resilience in the face of lingering cold. States and cities that moved quickly to open warming centers, mobilize the National Guard, and expand outreach to vulnerable residents managed to turn a weather emergency into a more manageable crisis. As the National Weather Service monitors the potential for yet another East Coast winter storm and warns of continued late January extreme cold, the message is stark. This was not a one-day disaster. It is a test of how well towns, cities, and families can endure days of deep snow, hard ice, and dangerous wind chills. Over just a few days, this winter storm transformed from a map projection into a nationwide stress test. Heavy snow buried neighborhoods from the Ozarks to New England. Thick ice in the south snapped trees and power lines. And now, Arctic air has settled over the central and eastern United States, refusing to move on. With the death toll standing at roughly 30 and hundreds of thousands still without power, the greatest danger now is not the snowflakes that have already fallen, but the long, grinding stretch of deep cold that follows them. Yet, in city after city, the same pattern of humanity appears. Neighbors are helping dig each other out. Volunteers and staff are keeping warming centers open. Line crews are working punishing night shifts to bring the lights back. This storm has demonstrated how fragile daily life can be when snow, ice, and extreme cold hit at once. but it also shows how much difference planning, clear warnings, and simple acts of solidarity can make. If you found this update helpful, consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you do not miss the next briefing. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and how are you and your community dealing with this winter storm and the brutal cold that followed it?